Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Thank you very much indeed for being here. My name is Bob Seeley. For those of you who don't know me, and it's lovely to see quite a few familiar faces in the audience. I'm your Member of Parliament. I think I'm interviewing Bill, because I've come across Bill quite often in the line of my work, but also my PhD was in Russian warfare. I lived in the former Soviet Union for a bit and then post-Soviet states. So is the microphone going in and out? Can everyone hear? Fantastic. So over and above my passion for the island, I have a great interest in what's happening in Russia and Ukraine at the moment, as I say, because of my experiences in a previous part of my life. We're going to have a conversation where Bill is going to be doing most of the talking for about 25 minutes to half an hour, which leaves hopefully a good amount of time for questions from the audience, from you good folks, because I think there's probably going to be quite a lot, because President Putin's mindset and what's going on in his mind is really quite important to the future of the world at the moment and what's happening in Russia and indeed the sad country of Ukraine. Please can we check that your phones are off, because there's nothing worse than being interrupted, and I have checked myself. I did actually go to the wrong church, and then I got to Trinity and realized I'd gone to the wrong place, so I'm not perfect on the organizational front, as my office will tell you. Without wishing to sound like an egotist, can I, Bill, go out first after we finish so that he can get to the book signing in the drawing room rather than have you good folks queuing up and Bill not being there. So let's get Bill out first and then we can all leave and chat about the interesting talk we've just had. What I'm going to do now is introduce Bill. It's a privilege to interview him. He's written 2 books about his experiences. I've read them both, and they're both incredibly good reads. And indeed, I found Freezing Order to be as good, as interesting as Red Notice, and sometimes sequels, if it was a sequel, is not always as good. But this was fascinating because it started to talk about some of the 14 murders that Putin may have committed in the UK, how Bill was continuing to be chased around the world using Putin using Interpol. Both are not only readable, but I suppose for me tell the disturbing Alice through the looking glass world that Russian business, Russian organized crime, and Russian politics has become under President Putin. Bill set up a large fund investing in Russian companies, and the fund went high and low depending on the stock markets. But then after a short time, he ran into the power of the oligarchs and Putin. And we're going to talk a lot about that because I think that's fascinating. What, for me as a politician in the West, has been the result of that are these extraordinary things called the Magnitsky Acts. And for those of you who don't know what the Magnitsky Acts are, Sergei Magnitsky, a young, highly capable lawyer, was beaten and tortured to death during the course of a major fraud in Russia. Magnitsky was Bill's lawyer. And after the murder of his lawyer, Bill has campaigned in the US and Scandinavia and Europe and the UK to bring in these Magnitsky Acts, which effectively make sanctions easier against state officials who commit human rights abuses. And as a lawmaker, which is what I am fundamentally, to actually be bringing in, to be the man responsible for bringing in such extraordinarily powerful and noble acts throughout the open and free world is a remarkable achievement, so thank you, Bill. Right, that's the intro. Bill, first of all, can I ask you to just, in a few minutes, just frame your experiences and why, take us from the first time you ended up in Poland and then Murmansk to the setting up Hermitage to when you started to run into the power of the oligarchs and the criminalized state.
Well, before I do that, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here on the Isle of Wight at this wonderful literary festival. And Bob, to thank you for your service and your leadership in Parliament, assisting me in the campaign for justice for Sergei Magnitsky, in which you played such a central role, which is, in spite of the train strike, why I got up early this morning to make sure that I could come here and honor you and honor the good people of the Isle of Wight. So great to be here. I've got an unusual background. I was born in Princeton, New Jersey, and I was brought up in Chicago. But I come from an unusual American family. My grandfather was a labor union organizer. Is this working okay? Yeah. In Wichita, Kansas. he was so good at organizing the union that he was spotted by the communists. And they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Russia to check it out? So he moves to Moscow in 1927. He meets a young Russian girl who becomes my grandmother. My father is born in Moscow. And in 1932, he's sent back to the United States to become the head of the American Communist Party for the next 13 years. He runs for president in 1936, 1940 against Roosevelt on the communist ticket. He's imprisoned in 1941, pardoned in 42. He's expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist. And then he's persecuted viciously in the 1950s for being a communist. So this is my family legacy. I'm born in 1964. I'm 58 years old. And when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I was trying to figure out a good way of rebelling from this family of communists. And I came up with the perfect idea, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And that really did upset my family. I become a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated business school in 1989, which was the year the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my life post-business school, I had an epiphany, which is that if my grandfather is the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. So that's what I set out to do. I first moved to London. I was working in a consulting firm in London, and the first assignment they had for me was to go out to a failing bus factory in Poland, in a little town called Sanok, which was 6 hours from Warsaw on the Ukrainian border. And in Poland, they were just going through the very first privatizations of Eastern Europe, and my bus factory where I was working wasn't being privatized, but I had a translator who had a newspaper under his arms with all these financial figures, and I asked him, what are these numbers? And he read them out to me. The first one was the number of shares outstanding of the company, which I can't remember the number, but the next one was the price of the shares, and you multiplied the two, and the value of the company was $80 million, and the next line was the profits for the previous year. And I said, what does this say? Or what is this line item? He said, profits for the previous year, and the number underneath was $160 million. And so you don't have to be a financial genius to know if the company is worth $80 million and they have profits of $160 million, that's probably a pretty good deal. And I bought some shares. My shares went up 10 times, and when you have that, if you make 10 times your money on an investment, it releases a certain chemical in your stomach, and you want to repeat that experience. And so I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to become an investor. I eventually get a job at Salomon Brothers, which is a big investment bank, an American investment bank. They sent me for my very first assignment to Russia, to Murmansk, to there's a fishing fleet located in Murmansk. I go up to Murmansk, and the head of the fishing fleet meets me at the ports. He takes me down to the docks, and I, again, do some simple math. I ask him how many of these, he has an enormous ship. It's like 400, 500 feet long on all these different stories. They catch the fish on the top, and then they process them. They eventually get down to the bottom of the ship, and it's a canning machines, and it's like an ocean-going factory. And I say, how much does one of these things cost? $20 million new. How many do you have in your fleet? 100, so that's $2 billion worth of ships. And they had hired me to advise them on whether or not to exercise their right under the privatization program to buy 51%. And I said, how much is the government selling 51% for? And he said, $2.5 million. So I was clearly onto something. I eventually quit Salomon, moved to Moscow, set up an investment business called the Hermitage Fund. The Hermitage Fund to invest in all these cheap companies. I bought lots of shares of companies. I got lots of people to give me money to invest. Things started to work out and went up. And then I discovered the worst part of the whole story, which is that these companies that I was investing in, they might have been looked like they were worth a lot on paper, but the management, generally the oligarchs, were stealing all the money out the back door, like literally all the money. And so I
do you mean the money from the day-to-day operations? Because at a certain point quite soon, this is going to get complicated because you've spotted all these great deals. Clearly there was a big rise in the market, there was a crash, etc. All that was going on, but there was a very post-Soviet dynamic. There were no rules, there were no laws, and there was an important point I read in Red Notice, I think it's probably on page 120 around there. You said at the time the oligarchs still respected the minor investors, but that quickly started to change as they started to effectively abuse the rights of other people, and wholesale sort of corruption, criminality, and the violence that came with it started to happen. Why were they at the time respecting the rights of smaller shareholders, all these big, powerful actors, some of them with organized crime backgrounds, some of them with political backgrounds, and why did they start to stop doing that?
Well, it's really interesting. So these oligarchs, they ended up owning the biggest oil companies, the biggest metals companies, the biggest all sorts of companies, and they didn't own them because they were honest. They were highly dishonest individuals that like bribed, threatened, did all sorts of stuff to get. 22 individuals ended up controlling 40% of the GDP of Russia. But what happened after they got control of these companies is that all of these very slick investment bankers from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and other big firms with their Brioni suits and their Hermes ties showed up in Moscow. And they would sit down with one of these oligarchs and they would say, you know, this is a really great oil company you have. We think we can get you some more money from Wall Street for your company. And the oligarchs, like, eyes lit up, like, we love money. And then the banker said, but it's really important that you just, you know, don't steal from your minority shareholders. And the oligarchs were like, whoa, that's not so easy. But then they thought, you know, we can get the money now and we can steal later. So they behaved themselves for a brief period of time, for about 2 years, with every instinct in their body wanting to steal.
What time period are we talking about?
So this would be 1996 to 1998. But then in 1998, the Russian government ran into real difficulties. They had borrowed way more than they could afford to borrow. The interest rates on the bonds that they were borrowing were like 100%. It was like loan sharking to a government, and eventually the government could not pay back the debt. And so the government defaulted on their domestic debt. This was August 1998. Many of you remember August 1998. They defaulted on their debt. They devalued their currency by 75%, and the stock market went down 90%. And they needed money. And so some of them started calling up those smarmy bankers from New York, and the bankers would pick up the phone and say, Vladimir who? And like put the phone down. Because they didn't want to have, they swore up and down the halls of Wall Street that they never had anything to do with Russia in the first place. And so the oligarchs were like, this is really awful. You know, I thought that they had money for us, but there's obviously no money because there was basically, Wall Street was closed for business. And so the oligarchs were extremely rational individuals. They said, well, there's no incentive now to behave, and there's never been any disincentive against misbehavior. There's no laws or property rights or rules in Russia. So in that case, why don't we just steal every last thing that's not nailed down and then figure out how to steal the stuff that's nailed down? And they went on, they embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. Asset stripping, transfer pricing, embezzlement, dilution, and they did it on an industrial scale. And that's where I was, sitting there trying to figure out, wow, I'm about to get all my money stolen from me.
And you started fighting these guys, perhaps unwisely, because you didn't, I mean, there was a sense in your book that bad things were coming, but maybe you hadn't sort of rationalized this. And there was an argument, and apparently the oligarchs didn't try to kill you at the time, because some of them assumed that Putin was your Krisha, meaning roof. Putin was your protection, because it seemed at one point that you and Putin were on the same side when he took over. That didn't last long, though, did it?
I started to do these naming and shaming campaigns, and by the way, and the way I would research how they do the stealing, and it was very interesting because.
Please tell us some examples. I found this so interesting. So this is really.
So Gazprom, which is the biggest company in Russia, Gazprom was trading at a 99.7% discount to BP and Exxon per barrel of reserves. And why was it so cheap? Everybody thought every last cubic meter of gas was being stolen from the company. And so we said, well, how do we figure out if it's true or not? And I made a list of the like 40 or so people I thought might know, might know and would talk to me. Ex-employees, government officials, ex-government officials, suppliers, customers, competitors. And I asked them all to have a meal with me. I invited them to breakfast, lunch, dinner, tea, coffee, dessert. And most of them said yes. I didn't give them my agenda in advance. I just said, have this meal with me. And I sat down at my very first meeting. It was with a competitor, a small competitor to Gazprom. And I sat down. We were in an Italian restaurant. I leaned forward and I said, what I really am here for is to figure out what's being stolen from Gazprom. And I didn't know whether the guy would then like get up and leave the restaurant. And he kind of perked up and just started to go into all these unbelievable stories. And I had a notebook with me and I was taking notes, and he was telling me this story and that story, and this was stolen and that person stole this, and it's unbelievable, and this is how much it's worth. And I was writing it all down, and we were like 2.5 hours into this meal, and he just kept on going. And basically what I discovered was that everybody was furious about the stealing. They weren't furious because it was morally outrageous. They were furious because they weren't being cut in on the deals, but furious nonetheless. And so I had to end the meeting. It just could have gone on forever. And just about every other meeting I had was the same thing. Everyone was happy to spill their guts to me, and I filled up 2 full notebooks full of this unbelievable allegations of malfeasance and stealing and graft and fraud.
And this is when sort of oil fields, gas fields the size of the North Sea were being sold for sort of $100,000 to people's cousins and etc.
Yeah, they would literally move a $1 billion gas field into another company, and then sell the company to the brother of the CEO for $100,000. But the trouble was, so I got all these unbelievable details, filling up all these notebooks. But it wasn't like I could go to the media and say I was at a lunch and a guy told me, because no journalist is going to write that up, and I certainly couldn't go to court. That's not evidence. And so I was really quite frustrated because I wanted to do something with this clear evidence, or I should say allegations of malfeasance. And I was very frustrated and not knowing what to do. And then one day my head of research was driving through Moscow, and he came to Pushkin Square. And Pushkin Square is a place where the traffic snarls up. And on a good day, you can get through Pushkin Square in 15 minutes. On a bad day, you're stuck there for an hour and a half in your car in traffic. And so these street urchins developed like a sort of outdoor market where they like sell stuff to the people who are stuck in the traffic. And my head of research, his name is Vadim, was sitting at this traffic jam, and some kid, one of the urchins, knocks on his window. He rolls down the window and he asks, what do you have? And normally they're selling things like cigarettes or pantyhose or X-rated DVDs or whatever. And he says, I've got databases. And Vadim said, what do you mean databases? The kid has this dirty down parka. He opens it up, and he has these translucent folders, and each of them has a disk in it. And Vadim points towards one of them, and he says, what's that? And he says, that's the Moscow Registration Chamber database, which was something we had been looking for. And he said, how much? $5. So Vadim gives him $5, takes the, everything sells for dollars back then, and takes the disc, comes back to the office, and he's waving this disc in the air, And he says, I've just bought the Moscow Registration Chamber database for $5. And I said, you've surely gotten ripped off. And he said, let's see. And this was back in the days before computer viruses, so we put the disk into the computer. And sure enough, it's like all bells and whistles, Moscow Registration Chamber database. But the best part is when we popped out the disk, there was a phone number on the front you could call for other databases. And so we called up the number and we got the Customs Committee database and the Federal Securities Commission database and all sorts of other databases. And from these databases...
Just on that point, on the databases, if you ever wonder where organizations like Bellingcat get the full list of who works for the Russian secret services, it comes roughly from the same sources. Do carry on.
There's no data protection in Russia. Basically, all the people who work in these ministries... it's a hugely bureaucratic country. If you go to the bathroom, you got to write your name on a piece of paper, and somebody collects that information. So the guys working in the ministries and the bureaucracy who collect this information are paid not enough money to feed themselves, and so they all put this information up for sale. And so, like, if I was having if we were both Russian and I was having a meeting with you and I wanted to figure you out before the meeting, I would find out your bank details, how much money you made. I would figure out your medical records if you're having any sort of embarrassing problems that you. I could figure out your.
This is called compromat, really, isn't it? It's a form of low-level compromising material.
Well, I mean, it's just non-data protection. You can use it for compromat. You can use it, and we use it for research into corruption. And we discovered in Gazprom that between 1996 and 1999, 9 members of the management of Gazprom had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait out of the company. Now, remember, there was a war fought over oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait in Kuwait, in the first Gulf War, and we've just discovered that a similar sized crime has taken place under the noses of the Russian population, and nobody knew about it. That was probably the most impressive economic statistic I've ever come across. The second most impressive economic statistic is that the oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.6% of Gazprom's total reserves. And what that meant was that more than 90% hadn't been stolen. So the market was assuming that 99.7% has been stolen. That's why it was trading so cheaply. And I've just discovered that most of it's still there. And so the first thing I did was I bought as much Gazprom as I could get my hands on. And then the second thing I did, and that's normally where you stop as a fund manager. You come up with some incredible discovery, then you buy the shares and you wait for the world to figure it out. But I didn't want to wait for the world to figure it out. I wanted to get them to figure it out really quick. And so I then took our dossier and I broke it into a number of different chapters. And I gave a chapter to the Wall Street Journal, the next one to the Financial Times, New York Times, etc. They all wrote stories about it. On the back of their stories, then the Russian press wrote stories. On the back of their stories, the parliament then began debates on whether it's a good thing or bad thing to steal these assets, more stories. And then the management of Gazprom hired an American accounting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to write a report to say it was a good thing to steal the assets, more stories. In the end, there were 500 stories written, and this comes back to Putin. And at that point, Vladimir Putin, this is 2001, newly elected president, steps into the fray and fires the guy who was doing all the stealing, the CEO, and replaces him with a friend of his whose job it is not to steal any more assets. I stress the word assets because he kept on stealing cash flow. But assets he wasn't allowed to steal. And on the back of that announcement, the share price doubled on one day. And then it doubled again, 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 and then it doubled again. In total, between 1999, when I started this campaign, and 2005, the shares of Gazprom went up 100 times. And I felt pretty good about myself, obviously. And I felt pretty good about Putin for firing the guy. And I thought that Putin was a good guy because, like, look, I exposed something, he steps in. And it turns out that we had a common interest. And I've never met Vladimir Putin, but at the time he became president, he wasn't all powerful like he is now. He was fighting with the oligarchs who had informally stolen all this power from him. And we had this alignment of interests. So he would step in. It wasn't just at Gazprom, it was a whole bunch of other companies. And I thought he was the best guy around there because I was doing these naming and shaming campaigns. I would expose him. He would step in. The share price would go up. Russia was getting cleaner. I was making money. It was all great. Unfortunately,
What went wrong?
well, what went wrong was that he decided to win his war with the oligarchs at the end of 2003 by arresting a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of an oil company called Yukos. And you've met him, and I know him as well. He's the richest guy in Russia. Putin arrests him, puts him on trial, and he puts him in a cage. And that's how in Russia there's like a 99.7% conviction rate, and so there's no presumption of innocence. You sit in, when you start a trial in a criminal case, you sit in a cage, and so they allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. And imagine you're the 17th richest person in Russia, and you've just turn on your television set and you see the guy far richer, far smarter, and far more powerful than you sitting in a cage. What do you want to do? You don't want to sit in the cage yourself. And so one by one, they all go back to Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in the cage? And he said 50%. And that's when...
Do you know that?
I know that. And I can't prove it... I can't prove it in a court of law.
He didn't want to clean up Russia. He just wanted to make sure that he got his share for his security services, or him personally.
Not for his security services. He wanted the money personally.
Okay.
He became the richest man in the world. He wanted he's just and this is a really important point, and nobody seems to want to kind of get their head around this point, which is that he's not in Russia. Nobody goes into public service to do anything other than steal money from the lowest traffic cop up to the president of Russia. That's all they're there for.
Can I just reassure you that's not the case here?
There's a few around, but not you, thank God. And that's all he cares about is stealing money and to become the biggest oligarch. He didn't want to get rid of the oligarchs. He just wanted to become the biggest oligarch. And it plays right into where we are today. And I know. How are we doing on time?
I'm not quite sure when we started. I think we've done about half an hour,
yeah.
And I do want to get some questions in. So can we just briefly go over Magnitsky? Let's talk about Putin's mindset for the questions. Tell me about Magnitsky, when it started to go wrong, when they started to come after you, and what were the circumstances that brought that about?
So I continued my naming and shaming campaigns after Putin became the 50% owner of all the things I was naming and shaming. And so at that point, it's no longer convenient. And so on November, I think it was November 5th, 2005, or maybe November 13th, anyway, I can't remember the exact date. In 2005, I was flying back to Russia from London. I'd been living there 10 years. I was the largest foreign investor, had a $4.5 billion fund in Russia. And I get arrested at the border at Sheremetyevo Airport. I get arrested. I wasn't sure whether they were sending me to Siberia, like they did to Khodorkovsky, or whether they were going to deport me. I sit overnight in the airport detention center, and then the next day, they, thank God, put me on an airplane back to London, and they deport me, declare me a threat to national security. Now, at this point, I'm shocked that this happened. I had no inkling this was coming, but I knew that when the Russians turn on you, they don't tend to do so mildly. They usually do with extreme prejudice. So I said, where else am I exposed? I've got a lot of people, a bunch of employees and their family members, and I've got a lot of assets. And so I organized an emergency evacuation of my staff, and I got them all out and their family members safely. They all live here. And once we got them out, we liquidated everything we held in Russia, and we got all of our money out, safe. And so I thought, okay, this has been a great run. And by the way, I got it out at the top of the market. I sold everything at the top of the market before it ever, it would all be worth zero now. I got billions out. And so I thought this has all been interesting and nice, and maybe I'll write a book about it someday, and time to move on to other things. Well, I might have been done with Russia, but that was the beginning of the worst nightmare you could ever imagine. And so 18 months after that, I get a call from the one person I have left in Russia, who is a lone secretary who's sitting in the empty Moscow office. And she said, there's 25 police officers raiding the office. And what should I do? And so I immediately call my lawyer, an American lawyer in Russia, and I say, there's 25 police officers raiding my office, what should I do? And he sounded really distracted. And he said, there's 25 police officers raiding my office right now. And my first thought was, I guess like everyone, like they're just raiding all offices now. But he said that they're looking for your documents, and then I realized this is just to do with me. They were looking for our stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies, which were empty at this point because we had sold everything. They didn't know that. They found them at the law firm's office. They seized them, and the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. They have been fraudulently re-registered using the documents they seized and put into the name of a man who had been convicted of manslaughter and let out of jail early. Now, I was terrified, not for any financial reasons, my money was safe, but I was terrified that if the police are working with killers to steal companies and identity thefts, I'm going to be walking through Frankfurt Airport one day and someone's going to grab me and arrest me on a Russian Interpol warrant. And so I went out and hired the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky, to investigate. He was 35 years old, he worked for an American law firm, and he was just a genius. And I asked Sergei to investigate and figure out what they're doing so we can stop it. He goes out and investigates, and he comes back and he says, there were two parts of the scam. The first part was to steal your money, but thankfully you got your money out before they could do that. The second part of their scam they succeeded in. And this second part was really cynical and quite smart, if you ask me, which was that when we were liquidating everything, when we sold out in the previous year, we declared a profit of $1 billion, and we paid to the Russian government $230 million of capital gains tax. What Sergei had discovered was that the people who stole our companies went back to the tax authorities on the 23rd of December, 2007, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't earn $1 billion, they earned zero. They came up with a complicated way of explaining that. They said, therefore, the $230 million of taxes that was paid in the previous year was paid in error, and we'd like it back. And so
they weren't stealing from you, they were using your company name to steal from the Russian state.
Correct.
So effectively, that's the battle you got involved with. It wasn't even your money.
It wasn't my money.
They were trying to get hold of. They were trying to steal a tax rebate illegally from the Russian state to enrich themselves.
Exactly. $230 million. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. They applied for it on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas, and it was approved and paid out the next day, Christmas Eve.
And this was an entirely sort of, there's a ministry of, is organised crime, the Kluchevoy crime gang? Was that the name? I can't remember. What was the name of the crime group?
Kluyev organized.
The Kluyev organised crime group, senior ministry of the interior officials. Everybody was in on this scam all the way.
Everybody, across the board. But I had this, I had this feeling, and so did Sergei, my lawyer, that Putin couldn't have approved this because he's a patriot and a nationalist. This was just like a rogue operation in the middle of his government, some bad apples. And so we thought if we just brought it to the attention of the highest authorities, then the good guys would get the bad guys. And so we wrote criminal complaints to the head of the Russian State Investigative Committee, the head of the Interior Ministry, the head of the prosecutor's office. Sergei gave sworn testimony against the police officers who conducted the raid. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys.
Okay, what happened?
Well, in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. Instead of going after the people who Sergei testified against, the same people he testified against came to his home and arrested him on the 24th of November 2008. They put him in pretrial detention, and then they began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. And they put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers And they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he had stolen the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And they figure here's a guy who wears a blue suit and a red tie and works in a fancy American law firm. He'll buckle within a week. But they totally misjudged Sergei. He was a man of incredible principle and integrity, and for him the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more awful and upsetting than the physical pressure they were subjecting him to. And he refused. And they just escalated the pressure and the torture. And his health then started to break down. He developed terrible pains in his stomach. He lost 20 kilos. And he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August 2009. A week before the operation, they come to him again, demand he sign a false confession. Again, he refuses. And in retaliation, they move him to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, which is considered to be one of the worst prisons in Russia. But most significantly for Sergei, there were no medical facilities there. At Butyrka, his health completely breaks down. He goes into a terrible downward spiral. He's in constant agonizing pain. He and his lawyers write 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. Every one of their letters was either ignored or denied in writing. And on the night of November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky goes into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore, and they put him in an ambulance and sent him across town to a different prison that had a medical wing. But when he arrived at this other prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat Sergei Magnitsky until he died. That was November 16th, 2009, 13 years ago. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news of his murder the next morning, and it was the most traumatic, heartbreaking, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he was my lawyer. He was killed working in my service. He would be alive today if he hadn't been. And when I was finally able to clear the fog of hysteria and heartbreak enough to think straight, I made a vow to his memory, to his family, and to myself that I was going to put aside my life as a business person, and I was going to devote all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energies to go after the people who killed him, to make sure they face justice. And for the last 13 years, that's what I've been doing.
Well, thank you so much indeed. I'm just aware that we've got about, although I'd love to continue carrying on with this line of conversation, I think now would be a great time to bring in some questions from you good folks in the audience. If you could shout out, we've only got the 2 microphones up here, so shout out your question, and if people can't hear it, I will just relay it, and let's see if we can get through as many questions as possible. So anyone who's got a question, please do. Sir, do you want to shout out? Did everyone roughly get a gist of that question? Fantastic. Bill?
So the answer is nobody knows. And part of the reason why Putin is in Ukraine is because since he came to power in the year 2000, he and the 1,000 people around him have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian people. And so in order to stay in, and that's unsustainable. You can't do that for 22 years, take everything away from everybody, put it in yachts and private planes and villas and not provide health care and all this kind of things that the state's supposed to provide. And so he's been worried about his grip on power. I mean, he's created a pressure cooker, an economic pressure cooker, and he's been worried about it exploding for some time. And what does a dictator do when they worry about the people unexpectedly rising up? A dictator tries to divert anybody's anger towards somebody else. Sort of Machiavelli 101. You start a war. And so this war is not about NATO, it's not about some grand vision of a Russian empire. This war is about fear of losing power. And so he started this war, and by the way, in starting the war, he could also do he can clear out anybody who's disloyal in his own ranks, and there's been many arrests and so on. He can get rid of all these pesky journalists who are asking questions and social media and all this stuff that he's completely cleaned it up, and he's gotten what I would argue is a genuine 85% approval rating. Most Russians were, I say were, not are, were in favor of this war. When it didn't touch their personal interests, they loved having a foreign enemy. They were loved rallying around the flag. But the war has worked out really catastrophically for him. He's lost somewhere about, I think, 62,000 soldiers have been lost. Another 60,000 have been disabled or are prisoners of war. And that's like more than half the legitimate fighting force he had there. And as a result, we've seen the unbelievable and very heartening gains that the Ukrainians have made in territory. And as a result of that, he was forced with an incredibly bad dilemma for himself, which is to lose the war to Ukraine, in which case, if he went to war as a strong man, you can't be a dictator and lose the war. It's just not possible. He would lose power, and if he loses power, what happens to him? He goes to jail and dies. So this is a war of survival for him personally. So what does he do? He goes out and he needs more physical people to fight on the front, even if they're not as good. And so he goes out and drafts some. They say the number is 300,000, and all the media is somehow repeating that they call it partial mobilization. It's nothing partial about it. They're drafting people, and it's probably closer to 1 million. And what does this do? All of a sudden, it affects everybody's personal interests, and it's really interesting because I've had a tragedy with Magnitsky and all the campaigns that I've been doing, and some Russians are extremely good people and with me and on my side, and there's a lot of Russians that just could not have cared less about the story I just told you about Magnitsky. It's cynical beyond belief, couldn't care less, just didn't faze them at all. And all of a sudden they're flapping around like this the end of the world because now it affects their personal interest and people they know or their sons or whatever are being drafted. And so now he's in a very bad place because there's 1 million people who've left the country. There's somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people who are going to be like slaughtered on the front lines. More people are going to be afraid of that. And he's in a very difficult position.
Just on that point, Bill, I know you wanted to mention Kara-Murza and say something about him as well, because he's actually a British citizen who's been charged with treason today, but he's a big Russian political activist. And clearly, Navalny is in prison. His health is deteriorating. It's not impossible that he will no longer be with us in the next few months at some point, and Putin will take the attitude, I've killed 60,000, what's another 1 or 2 more?
Well, so this is really important. So as I said, there are these, most of the Russians are in this cynical, I just want to carry on with my life, make my money, I don't care. And then there's a few Russians, and I especially want to talk about Vladimir Kara-Murza in my second book, Freezing Order. He's one of the heroes of my book. He went around with me to the British Parliament, to the Canadian Parliament, to the European Parliament, to the U.S. Congress, lobbying for the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is the legislation that we get used to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky, which freezes assets and bans visas of human rights violators from Russia and elsewhere, and it's been used to punish Magnitsky's killers. And he went around the world with me doing this, and he was so effective and so passionate and so persuasive that the Russian government tried to kill him twice with poison in 2015 and 2017. And he was so brave that he went back to Russia after the war started. And I had dinner with him 3 nights before he went back, here in London, not here in London, in London. And I begged him not to go, and he said, how can I ask the Russian people to stand up to Putin if I'm too afraid to go there myself? And he went there. He went on TV. He's called Vladimir Putin a killer, a murderer on CNN. An hour later, the police were at his house. They arrested him, and he's now. They then first charged him with calling the war a war, which is a 9-year prison sentence. They then charged him for being a member of an undesirable organization, another 5 years. That's 14 years. And then just yesterday, they charged him with treason, which is 22 years. And so he's somebody that all of our Western government should stand up for.
Brilliant. More questions, please, folks. Gentleman at the back, sir.
The Russians are extremely generous when it comes to bribery. Politicians in this country are extremely cheap when it comes to being bribed. And the Russians are nonpartisan bribers. And so I will give you 2 examples. So the Russians hired a conservative peer named Lord Barker of Battle. And I say the Russians, Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch who's been on the U.S. sanctions list since 2017 because he's one of Putin's closest friends. He hired Lord Barker of Battle to try to get him off the sanctions list, and he went with his Lord cap on to Washington and was able to get him off of partially his company off of the sanctions list, and in exchange he got a $5 million success fee. And then I'd like to go over to the labor side of the aisle in the House of Lords, and this is Lord Goldsmith, the former Attorney General. He was paid by a consigliere of the Kluyev organized crime group in Russia named Andrei Pavlov to lobby the European Parliament to keep Andrei Pavlov and various other Russians off of the EU Magnitsky sanctions list. And he was, and I've seen the receipt for £75,000 that he was paid for that. And so these guys here are extremely cheap. They would cost a lot more to corrupt people in other countries. I think Merkel, or not Merkel, what's his name? Schroeder goes for much more. And I tell you what really upsets me, and let me just say this in the presence of my friend Bob here, is that nobody seems to care about the sanctity of the institution. I mean, why is there not an initiative now to like reform the House of Lords and fix this? I mean, how could they not? How could there not be an investigation into this? How could there not be these people being expelled from the House of Lords? Why is there not new rules being set up so that this never happens again? I'm infuriated. I'm a British citizen. I've been here for 33 years. I'm infuriated that if this had happened in other countries, there would be a scandal, people would have gone to jail, etc. And it just goes on like nothing ever happened here.
Bill, I'm just going to add to that because it's a fair point, although a slightly partisan one. What we've witnessed since 2000 is probably the largest theft in history. It's come not via British banks, but via Scandinavian and German banks. But the British angle has been that money, a lot of it has come through the City of London, it's come through the finance houses, and it came through the law firms that effectively protected this vast caravan of stolen wealth. but stolen by the state. So you're not talking about drugs cartels, you're talking about people with titles and official status. And I'm not excusing anything, but it was a new form of criminality. And unfortunately, we didn't get our heads around it. We didn't get our heads around it under New Labour, we didn't get our heads around it under the coalition, and we haven't got our heads around it, and it's taken a war for us to do the right thing. Do I defend that? Absolutely not. And for the record, I've made my opinion of Lord Barker very admirably clear. I've also made my opinion of Lord Mandelson very clear, and Lord Goldsmith very clear. And if you want to go back and look at my contributions in Hansard, you will see in almost every debate on economic crime, the abuse of law firms by oligarchs, me, Margaret Hodge in Labour, David Davis in the Conservatives, Liam Byrne in Labour, and a few other people have consistently attacked what has been happening. We will be speaking very loudly on the economic crime bill coming up to try to make it as broad and as deep as possible. But if there's one person above all who's been attacking the law firms in Parliament, it's been me and David Davis. So I agree what you say, but just to say 500 quid to a backbench politician is proof of corruption, it's so small scale. The greatest corruption has been this vast flow of wealth through the finance houses, through the law firms, and frankly the politicians at the end of the trail have been relatively small fry. So, but is that a good enough answer? No. And I assure you that, well, Bill is my witness here. If you know anyone else who tries harder to clear it up, you will tell me. So.
I don't know what Putin is going to do, but what I can say is that Putin is a psychopath. He has no empathy for anybody. His heart doesn't start beating faster if someone is being tortured to death in front of him. And if somehow using nuclear weapons would lead to his survival in a situation where he was in mortal danger, he would surely do that. Having said that, it's hard to see how using nuclear weapons could guarantee his survival. So it certainly wouldn't if he tries to. So that guy's waving in the back there.
This is our 5-minute wind-up. It has to be dramatic, otherwise I don't see it.
Okay. Putin is certainly not going to threaten us with nuclear weapons because it would be mutually assured destruction. That was the reason why no one started a nuclear war. Could he use a tactical nuclear weapon? The answer is yes. But everyone's been talking about this the last couple days. But the big question is, what does he gain from using a tactical nuclear weapon? Does it ensure his survival? What does it do? And so let's say that he lobs some small nuclear weapon which kills 100,000 people in eastern Ukraine somewhere. So what happens next? First of all, there is a fallout cloud. Which direction does it go in? Could go east. I think the winds go from west to east. What happens to all of his friends who he continues to trade with? The Indians, the Chinese, the Brazilians. I think they all abandon him. And the moment somebody crosses the nuclear threshold, I think they become totally isolated. He becomes like North Korea. And most importantly, does he win the war by doing so? Do the Ukrainians all of a sudden surrender and say, that's it, we're surrendering? And I don't think they do. And so I think that it's much more likely he's going to do things like blow up pipelines and destroy our infrastructure. And like just a few minutes ago, as I was entering into the church here, I read a story about how there's been sabotage on German railways, and this is in addition to the pipeline. And so I think we should expect all sorts of nastiness, all sorts of escalation, all sorts of disruptive things that we couldn't even imagine. But I just don't envisage, at least in the short term, any huge benefit. The threat of nuclear weapons is much better than the actual use of them.
I think that's certainly true. I was in the Conservative Party conference with a bunch of Ukrainian MPs who I was escorting, and I have to say the Ukrainians think the decision to use nuclear weapons or not will come by the new year. I thought it would come by early summer, but such is the rate of the Russian collapse, and it might happen sooner if such a decision is made. I'm just going to take a very quick final, can it be very quick questions?
Yeah, so in case you didn't hear at the back, Trump, Putin. So at the 2018 Helsinki summit, it was the Monday after 12 Russian military intelligence officers were indicted by Robert Mueller, the special counsel. And the big question was whether Russia would hand them over to the Americans. And so the journalist at the press conference asked Putin, "Are you going to hand over the 12 GRU officers?" And he said, "Yes, it's possible we would if Donald Trump hands over me, Bill Browder." And then they went to Trump and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "I think it's an incredible offer."
You were genuinely quite. Well, I remember that in the book. And I've just reminded you were genuinely quite worried there, weren't you, for a couple of weeks?
The most important man in the free world is offering to hand me over to a guy who wants to kill me. And eventually the Congress, U.S. Congress, voted 98-0 not to hand me over. Thank God. Just really quickly, because I know we're running out of time, I don't think that Putin has any compromise on Trump. I shouldn't say that. I'm sure he has a ton of compromise on Trump, but Trump is uncompromisable. He's unblackmailable. He could literally do anything, and there would be no. Is
it the fact? You see, all this sort of sex tape stuff. I think so what? Because it's so difficult to prove stuff about that, consensualness or not. The stuff that is potentially dangerous for Trump is Russian organized crime and money laundering through property empire. Should it have taken place if these allegations were true? But even with somebody like Trump, you're better always holding that back, because what it seems to me that Trump in Putin's presence is a man who's extraordinarily nervous for reasons which are unfathomable. He's deeply uncomfortable around Putin, and I think that is because what plays in his mind most effectively is the fear that Putin has stuff on him that can destroy him. But once you, it's a bit like nuclear weapons. Once you use that, the fear goes. But to hold that back and to have Trump always being deeply uncomfortable in your presence, or always feeling somebody's got something on him, that's the real power.
Well, that may be the case, but there's one other thing. So that's the stick. But Trump is very easily incentivizable, and basically, the way I feel about Trump is that he's just a sleazy New York real estate guy, and you know, he likes rich guys who might give him some money for stuff. That's how he thinks. And so who does he want to be friends with? He wants to be friends with Putin because he's the richest man in the world. He wants to be friends with Mohammed bin Salman and Xi Jinping because they all have money. You know, Angela Merkel can go to hell because where's the money going to come from her? None. But and I think it's just as simple as that. And guess what? His son-in-law gets a $2 billion investment from Mohammed bin Salman, even after the Saudi, the professional advisors said this guy is totally unqualified to manage money, and that's probably just the tip of some iceberg. And so I think that Trump just loves rich guys who might give him some money. That's as simple as that.
On that prescient note, Bill, thank you so much indeed. It's been. I'm just going to say something for 1 second. No, hold on 1 sec, Bill, because I'll walk out with you. But I just want to say thank you. The thing that most impressed me about all the stuff that you've done, because clearly you're a very wealthy man, very successful, is actually your loyalty to Sergei Magnitsky. And I think that, for me, is absolutely vital. So thank you. Right. Are you going to go up to the door and... Yeah, I'll go up.